This is Duke University.
Welcome, and on behalf of the school, thanks for joining us and participating in this session. I'm Manju Puri. I've taught many of you in my Raising Capital class, and joining me is David Robinson, who's also taught many of you in his Entrepreneurial Finance class. And so the way we're going to proceed is we're going to have questions coming in from alumni, and so we already have some questions which were sent to us earlier. And you can continue to give us questions.
Yeah, that's right. If you'd like to send us questions, you can send them via Twitter. Tweet your question using the hashtag Fuqua alumni.
Okay.
Why don't we go ahead and get started with some of the questions that we received from alumni prior to the event?
Sounds good.
We've got a question from Kristen Wall, Daytime 2009. She writes, did you look at whether the optimism you found was an overall personality trait versus a situational personality trait? And in particular, in an economic downturn, I would expect people to be more pessimistic as a whole, wondering if there's any way to determine how that affected their decision making. We actually spent quite a lot of time worrying about whether this optimism that we were looking at was situational versus more of a personality trait.
And in fact, we're not the only ones, right? If you look at the psychologists, there's a huge literature trying to figure out optimism, and there are two kinds of optimism, sort of what is called domain-based, or situational specific, and dispositional optimism, which just sort of pertains
more
to
of a personality trait.
Personality traits and everything in your life.
Yeah, when we first developed this life expectancy miscalibration measure, and we were immediately interested in exactly this question: is it measuring something that's situational, or is it measuring this broad-based personality trait? And we kind of thought that it would be more of a personality trait because, if you think about it, life is kind of big and broad. So if you ask someone about how long they expect to live, you kind of feel like you're tapping into kind of broader-based beliefs about optimism. But we wanted to be sure. So what we did is we went out and went to one of the executive MBA programs and ran a short survey where we got them to take an actual life expectancy, life orientation test, which is a standard psychometric test for calibrating dispositional optimism. So we got their scores from this test, and then we also administered the questions that we needed in order to measure life expectancy miscalibration. And so then we could correlate these two measures, and we thought that would be a good way to kind of answer this question: were we looking at something situational or something more personality related? Yeah, and we actually found it was more personality.
And we found a very strong correlation, which suggested it was sort of personality based. And not only that, right, we found even if you were optimistic, about your lifespan, turns out you're optimistic about all kinds of things,
exactly,
right? Is the economy going to do well?
So we could go in behind this and ask, what do you think is going to happen in the economy over the next 5 years? Is it going to go up? Is it going to stay the same? Is it going to get worse? What's going to happen in your neighborhood, in your area? What's going to happen in your household? Right. And you could see there's a very clear pattern across all of these questions pointing to this, sort of tapping into a broad-based optimism. I did some follow-up work with Ron Keneal and Cade Massey, who some of you may remember because they were both here for a number of years. And we, as I mentioned in the video that some of you may have watched before today, we tracked daytime MBA students for a number of years. And thanks to all of you who participated in the survey. We had students from 2007, 2008, and 2009. So in particular, we had students who were affected by the financial crisis. And we could look at their optimism scores and compare the scores in the crisis year to scores from prior years. And this is getting to the second part of Kristen's question. We could see clear evidence that the optimism scores were lower in the 2009 cohort. And in particular, that was especially strong among U.S. citizens. We were able to, the survey allowed us to tell whether we were looking at the response of a U.S. citizen or a student who had come to Fuqua from abroad. And students who had come to Fuqua from abroad really didn't experience much of a drop in their optimism, but the students who were U.S. citizens really did. So although it is kind of a broad-based personality trait, it does seem that it is buffeted by these broad economic patterns that kind of shook the whole world. It's very hard to know. The final part of your question was whether it influences their decision making, and it's a little hard to say at this point how, in particular, the change that would have occurred in 2009 might have affected their decision making. That's something that we kind of hope to follow up on and learn a little bit more about in the years ahead, as we can kind of watch the aftermath of this in more detail. But that's a great question. Great way to get us started.
So I have a question that came on Twitter. And it says, the workplace condemns pessimistic news in individuals. Do we face pressure from the environment to be optimists? So that's a good question.
It depends on your environment, right?
It depends on your environment, right? So the realists are typically the pessimists, which is perhaps not good news. I guess one of the things that our research does say, right, is to be optimistic somewhat is a good thing, right? And so even if we're not going to be pressurized by our environment, but we just want to do, what is best for us, it turns out being optimistic, moderately optimistic is a good thing, right? And so I would look at it from that perspective as a positive thing, right? And it turns out if we're optimistic, I think others tend to see that. So in the work that I did, where we surveyed CEOs and we administered them this LOTAR test, right, the psychometric test, and we found CEOs are just incredibly optimistic. We also surveyed CFOs and asked them, what do you think about your CEOs? And the CFOs also thought that the CEOs were very optimistic. And so if you are optimistic, it sort of radiates. People sort of get it. And I think our research suggests it's overall a good thing.
Yeah, just to add to what you're saying, there are a couple of points I want to add. One is that I kind of agree with your question, Leandro, that I think the environment does kind of pressure us to be optimistic, but it depends a little bit on the environment. In particular, law is a profession that tends to reward pessimism, and so psychologists have studied this and looking across different vocational domains. In particular, the law is one where being a pessimist tends to be rewarded. So I think you have to be a little careful drawing broad generalizations about how the environment pressures you to be optimistic, because clearly that's an environment where there's sort of built-in incentives not to be overly optimistic. At the same time, my co-author Cade Massey has done some interesting work looking at this, where he got people to read vignettes, I guess you could say, little scripts that described a character and a situation that the character faced. And then he asked the people in the study to kind of describe what they think the character ought to do. And what he found is that people prescribe optimistic behavior. In other words, they want to see other people behave optimistically. So I think that supports what you're saying in your question, that there is sort of this environmental pressure to be optimistic, and I think when we look at people behaving in situations, we kind of want them to take the optimistic course of action just by our very nature.
Yeah, that reminds me, I think I had read somewhere, movies and what the endings could be, and it turns out most people always want the happy ending, right? Not
we don't like to
unhappy.
see the main guy get killed at the end.
Yeah, so very, very similar.
You got any more in there?
Yeah, so I have two questions that are somewhat related. So one is from Lifeng Wang, MMS 13, and the other is from John Lewis, the class of 11. Okay, and the questions are, so from Lifeng Wang saying, optimism has intrigued me, it enables people to be positive, but my questions are, are there ways for people who always consider risks and downsides first, so they're naturally less optimistic, to develop their levels of optimism? And then she goes on to ask how big of a difference in terms of years is moderate for the life expectancy survey. What are your thoughts on what will happen when things don't go the way that optimistic people have wished? And the question that's related from June Lewis is, I realize this may almost fall within the self-help domain, but I would like to know whether you have found any way of acquiring or enhancing these personality traits you found are more desirable or more commonly associated with successful profiles. So, that's a great question. It's the very first question I had, when we did the Optimism paper, right? And as an individual, as a mother with 2 children, and I said, hey, if optimism is so good, is there a way that I can inculcate it, make my children better at dealing with things and, make better decisions, perhaps more successful? And so, it's a great question. I don't know if we have, the best answer for it yet. I think it's a question that a lot of disciplines are looking at, the psychologists and everyone else, and trying to figure out, what are the things that you could do to sort of develop optimism. And as you said, a lot of the self-help domain also deals with that. Many religions deal with, no matter what happens, you just sort of keep on going, right? And so the underlying theme is, stay positive, keep on it, be optimistic, right? Coming from all domains of life.
That's right, that's right. I mean, I think the answer to this question, to some extent, depends on who you ask it to. There's certainly a branch of psychology that focuses on on helping people build, positive personality traits and sort of reinforce those things. And there's this idea in psychology that you have this learned helplessness, that negative stimuli in your life sort of accumulate and sort of teach you to expect bad things to happen. And so the premise there is that if you can unlearn some of these, this helplessness, you can actually take, you can build this positive personality. You can improve these personality traits that we're talking about in these questions. I'm not a psychologist, so it's a little bit hard for me to weigh in and say like how solid is that? I can't say. I'd like to believe that it's effective, because I would like to, like you say, I look at my kids, I look at myself, and I ask the same question: how do I make myself more positive? Because I think it's something we all deal with. I mean, we all sort of see optimistic, happy people out there, and we kind of want to be more like them, in spite of the fact that we struggle to deal with the doubt and the pessimism that just kind of comes with everyday life. So I think that, there's certainly some people out there who think that you can learn these things and improve. And I think if you look across, as you say, Manju, all these different domains in life, religion, philosophy, psychology, there's so many...
Positive psychology.
Right. There's so many external cues kind of encouraging people to adopt these personality traits, that there must be something to that. It must be possible to kind of learn them. If you can figure out how to learn it, please let us know.
Please let us know, absolutely.
Because I'll be the first subscriber to your plan if you can figure one out.
Right.
Because it's something I ask myself all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was one question here: how big of a difference in terms of years is moderate for the life expectancy survey? And so, David, in our paper, right, the surprise is it's not,
it's not huge. It's not huge. It's like, it's sort of a believably large number. It's like 3 years on average or something like that. If we found that optimists thought they were going to live, 20 years longer than someone else, I think we would have known that already, right? Because they would just behave so incredibly differently than other people.
Right. Those are our extreme optimists.
Yeah,
right?
I guess that's right. Yeah. I mean, so sort of moderately optimistic people, they think they're going to live 2-3 years longer than everybody else.
Yeah.
It's long enough for people to make, sort of modest differences in planning and stuff, but they don't look crazy.
Yeah, and in fact, that was our surprise, right? Because, I mean, for me, if you ask, how long do you expect to live, the fact that people actually get it pretty close,
Yeah,
right?
it's kind of remarkable.
It's remarkable, and consistently so.
The
right?
other thing here that you got to remember too is that we're using life expectancy tables that are based on current data. You know, as health outcomes improve, as medicine improves, as people's behaviors improve, people live longer, and so there might actually be sort of a negative bias in the health table. So it might be that sort of on average people are right. By thinking they're going to outlive the life table
because
by just a couple
technology
of
has
years.
moved and medical science has moved.
So
Absolutely.
you know, it's kind of remarkable to me that people are actually as good as they are at sort of forecasting this.
No, absolutely. And related to that, we have another question on Twitter, which actually fits in very well with our discussion.
Yeah.
So Shannon Lewis asks, did you find age was a factor? I would expect young people to think they will live to 100, but an older person might not. I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah, it's a great question because when you're young, you sort of, you know, the end of your life seems just infinitely far away. At least it certainly did to me, and now it seems a good bit closer. You know, I remember we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that age wasn't one of these confounding factors.
Exactly.
That it wasn't driving all of our results. Now, what did we find? I don't remember.
So first, you know, how long you expect to live, right? I mean, it is conditional on your age, right, at some level, right? And so if you're 85...
Well, if you're 75, you haven't died yet.
Exactly,
so,
right? And so there's some inbuilt conditioning already, right, built there, right? And so what are the chances that you live to be 90? If, you know, if you're 85, that's different than if you're 20, right? And so some of that is already there. And then we did have age as one of our controls.
I think that so what happens is that the life expectancy tables account for your age. And so my recollection from our results is that age itself didn't play a huge factor in sort of what was the magnitude of the life expectancy miscalibration.
Right, but the miscalibration, I mean, the statistical life expectancy is itself a function of your current age, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why it probably
I think that's why it kind of washes out.
It washes out, right? That's exactly my feeling too.
Yeah, and I don't remember that young people were especially prone to being wildly miscalibrated, thinking they were going to live to 100. I think, you know, if anything, you saw that more in sort of the 35 to 45 year age group, and these were people who had really bad habits. I mean, these were, you know, people who were much more likely to be smokers, had much poorer savings decisions. So, you know, I don't remember it being clustered in any one particular age
I don't.
group.
And we have another related question just coming from Twitter. Jose Treza, Gamba06 asks, based on your research, is there any correlation between age or demographics and optimism level? And
men were more optimistic than women.
We found men were slightly more optimistic than women.
Perhaps without good reason, right?
Perhaps, you know, because they're married to women.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't recollect a clustering otherwise in terms of age.
Not in
other.
terms of age. In fact, you know, we've been spending a lot of time talking about optimism over the last few minutes, but in our original work, we were also interested in understanding how, like, attitudes towards retirement and things like that were also driving some of these decisions. And I remember in particular that we took great care in making sure that the age of the respondent wasn't a factor in understanding how their decisions towards retirement.
Okay, so we have another Twitter question by Stephen Warwick. I am concerned that we are mixing up optimism is equal to right decisions versus optimism is equal to career success.
That's
a good point.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that's a fair point.
It's fair, and I think our research suggests optimism is more like you make, again, right, you know, in inverted commas, decisions. And I think one might argue that if you keep making the right decisions, you know, you're going to you'd like to hope you'll be successful in the long run.
Arc bends slowly towards success, at least.
Right.
Yeah, but let's stress though that we are talking about two different strands of research. There's the work that you and I have done together that's looking at, you know, the survey of consumer finances, where we have this huge broad swath of the U.S. population, and we have this summary measure of their optimism level, and we can correlate that with lots of, as Stephen says, right decisions that they make in terms of savings behavior, investment behavior, work behavior, and stuff. And then there's the work that you've done with John Graham and Cam Harvey and others,
right,
kind of looking at career trajectories. And I don't think we should overstate the connection between these, right? I mean, there's not strong evidence that the right decisions that people are making are what's responsible for them sort of moving through the through the career.
I wouldn't make the causal statement at all, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we do see that CEOs are more optimistic, right? But is it optimism that is
of right decisions got them to that point?
No, it does not.
I think it's important.
It does not. So it is important to, I think, make that
distinction. These are really
distinction.
separate bodies of work that are connected through optimism and the role that optimism plays in affecting people's decision making. But to claim that optimism causes people to make good decisions, and then the good decisions in turn cause them to, in turn have a better career outcomes than other people.
We don't have any evidence of that.
We don't have the data. That may be true.
We might
It might well be true,
hypothesize,
but I don't think we can say that with what we've done.
Absolutely, I'd agree with that. Okay, so we have some more questions here. So let me put together a couple of questions which deal with the CEO attitudes. So Doug Eisner, class of 07, asks, is there a correlation between levels of optimism, moderate versus extreme optimism, and CEO performance? And Laura Basil, also class of 07, asks, in the finding of CEO attitudes and optimism, do you have any industry-specific findings? So do you, in different industries, do CEOs have different levels of optimism? Those are both sort of great questions, right? So let me just take them one by one, right? And so the answer on CEO performance, right, is we really don't know, right? Because the way we administer the survey, so it's to CEOs. Now, they don't have to reveal their companies. So some of them may voluntarily choose to, so we can't really see their companies and how they're performing and sort of make that link. I think it would be a great thing to do. But, part of the way we got a good response rate was by
offer them that
exactly, because they don't want to reveal their company, they shouldn't have to. And it would be a great thing to look at, but we haven't been able to do that.
These questions are making me think we should probably get busy with some follow-up research.
Yeah, absolutely, because these are all really great questions, right? Now on differences between attitudes of CEOs between different industries, do we find that? So again, this is not something we looked at separately, but I can tell you what we did do, right? And so I know when we just looked at all CEOs versus across everything and compared them to CFOs, we found that the CEOs are much more optimistic. And again, there's just been so many psychology papers looking at optimism. We have a good benchmark, and so CEOs are like way out there in terms of optimism. Now, when we match by like size, so you might think, larger company CEOs might be more optimistic, or public company CEOs, they might be different from private company CEOs, etc. And so part of what we did was we tried to, do a lot of matching to see if the results are different. They're actually very similar, right? And so we don't seem to, I think, at least obviously see very systematic differences there. But we do see very systematic differences between CEOs and CFOs, and between U.S. CEOs and non-U.S. CEOs, whether they're Asian, whether they're European.
The U.S. guys being more optimistic.
U.S. guys being just much more optimistic.
We've just gotten a question in via Twitter from Forrest Baker, 2007, who asks, do you think employers would be well served by administering an optimism battery to prospective employees? In other words, through the hiring process, should you try to screen on optimism? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, Manju. I've thought a lot about this, and I guess my knee-jerk reaction is that it had better be a good optimism battery if you're going to administer it in that context, because my immediate concern would be that it's very easy to game the test. And that, you go in for a job, just smile, look happy, and of course I'm optimistic. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
And so I'd be a little bit concerned about.
Are you a good person? Of course I'm a good person.
What do you mean? Of course. What do you want me to say? Yeah. I'd be a little concerned about the validity of the responses coming out of a test like that. That being said, if you could get a more nuanced understanding of someone's personality with respect to their optimism, you might gain some real insights, and you could see perhaps using it in maybe a later stage where you'd already kind of decided that you wanted to hire the person, but maybe you were trying to decide about where to put them. You could imagine using sort of a personality inventory to kind of guide them towards one area or another.
Yeah, and I think, again, you want to be a little careful here, right? Because what does our research find? We find CEOs are much, much more optimistic. Now, did they get there because someone measured their optimism and put them there? Probably not.
Probably not.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what got them there is, a lot of actions,
process.
A lot of performance, a lot of matching, right? And this matching is something actually we find very good evidence for, right? And so one of the things we find when we do the CEO survey, and so we measure optimism, but we also measure risk aversion. So we give them gambles to figure out how risk-loving they are. And what we find is there's a matching of the CEOs, how risk-loving they are and what their compensation package looks like. Right, and so if I'm risk-loving, what would you expect in your compensation package?
Yeah.
A lot of stocks and options. That's what you see, right? And so
they sort into these different categories.
So you see the sorting, right? And you might think companies are the same way, right? So think of growth companies, startups. Maybe you require a certain personality type. Maybe mature companies require others, right? It's not clear, ex ante of what you should want. Maybe mature companies need new thinking. Right, and so you need to be very careful.
This question reminds me, though, of some of the work that Ron and Kate and I did when we were studying daytime MBA students, because as some of you watching may remember, we decided, at least with one cohort, that we wanted to test whether the optimism that we were measuring through the psychological test was something that was kind of being broadcast to other people around them. So at the end of the 2 years of the MBA program, we asked people to go back and look at their section mates and think about who was the most optimistic, who was the most likely to be a CEO, so on and so forth. And this was important because it allowed us to control for this obvious explanation for why optimism might be affecting some of these job search outcomes, which is that you just look like a sunny, happy person. You think good things are going to happen to you because, in fact, they do. Because you sort of project this onto other people. Right. And it's absolutely the case that these measures of sort of the outward glow of optimism that you sort of shine outward impacts, these job search outcomes. But the correlation wasn't as strong as you might think. It certainly wasn't 100%. It was, it explained about a third of the overall optimism result. And so, so that suggests that some of this optimism sort of does naturally shine outward and can just be readily seen by other people, but that, having said that there's still this part that sort of can't be measured, that's more difficult to measure, that affects outcomes.
Absolutely. Okay, so Gary Lynn, class of 05, has asked David, where is the bow tie in this video? I thought that was your brand. Are you rebranding? Okay.
Sorry, Gary.
Yeah, okay. And then he goes on to ask, I would be interested in risk-taking attitudes of MBA students, as I suspect they will be far less so than CEOs. What happens along the way?
Yeah, I'm not, that's a great question, Gary, notwithstanding the comments about the bow tie. I think that, so one of the things that we don't know, and it'd be very interesting to study this more carefully, what we don't know is whether the process of going from Fuqua grad to CEO causes an individual to become more risk-taking, or whether what's happening is there's just variation in the pool of graduates, some of whom are going to become CEOs and some of whom are not. The more risk-loving of them being the ones who naturally become CEOs. In other words, is it selection or is it treatment? And honestly, I don't think we have a very clear understanding of this process. There's a lot that goes on. You can think about this process by which a Fuqua grad kind of evolves into being a senior manager at a large organization as one kind of this labor tournament. And we don't know how this tournament changes people's behavior and attitudes, or if it's just taking immutable characteristics and selecting on them. I think it's
it would be a great question.
Yeah, it's something we need to understand better, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, what would the right experiment be? I mean, you'd want a study that spanned 20 or 30 years, right? I mean, because by that time we'll both be retired and maybe under, but that's really what you want, right?
Don't be so pessimistic.
I know, I need to be more optimistic.
I'm still going to be working.
Right, but these long-term studies, right, where you just follow them and, it's like they track the children, that's sort of what you want, and so far...
There are these studies that look at, like, depression babies. And, CEOs who were born in the Depression, they run their companies more conservatively than CEOs from similar, close-by cohorts that were not affected by the Depression.
That's right.
Right, and so there is this evidence that these early life experiences kind of put a stamp on you, and that's hard to change. Now, so that would suggest that a lot of it is selection, that it's just, you're just selecting on traits that people have that are kind of difficult to change. But we really need to run the experiment, in order to collect the data to understand whether this labor tournament process actually changes people or not.
Yeah, and so we have a question on Twitter related.
This is very closely related to this discussion from Robert Martins asking, do you believe optimism to be a learned or developed trait? This is, I think this is one of the most fascinating questions in economics right now. There's
Absolutely.
a huge group of labor economists in particular who are studying this question, trying to understand how interventions early in people's lives can affect later life outcomes. And so Jim Heckman from the University of Chicago is one of the sort of the leading lights in this area. They've gone back and looked at groups of people that they offered interventions to 20 years ago. And we're talking about experiments that were run in, say, the 1980s with mothers of newborns in lesser developed countries. So they've gone. So they gave these mothers with newborns. They gave them some coaching, and followed up years and years later. And the children of the mothers who receive these coaching exercises have statistically measurable differences in the quality of life, like the quality of earnings, the quality of educational attainment. So there is there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that many of the things that we're talking about now can actually be impacted, especially early in a person's life. Whether it's possible to go in and intervene sort of in a high school age, or college age, or post-college age person and make a profound difference in their level of optimism, I think is very much up in the air. Not nearly as easy to show.
It's like, should we have a class on optimism at the MBA level, and would that make a difference?
Probably not. We might want to have that class at the kindergarten level.
Right.
Like going in and teaching kindergarten kids how to be more optimistic, that could actually potentially change their behavior later on. But something seems to happen where the personality gets cemented by some, at some early point in a child's life, and then after that, it seems relatively hard to change these behaviors. It's a great question, one that is receiving quite a lot of attention in economics these days.
Absolutely. Okay, so David Isaac, class of 78, has a message. It's actually a comment. So it's interesting. It's long. I'm going to sort of paraphrase it. And he says, I'm interested in the study of optimism, particularly because of the work I do as a predictive index consultant. The predictive index is a managerial assessment tool that has been used worldwide since the mid-50s that provides insight into natural workplace behaviors and motivations of employees based on 4 motivational factors: dominance, extroversion, patience, and formality. This is taken as a quick online survey. The results can be used to improve hiring decisions for jobs, team performance. I've been doing this for 5 years and have found that this is, consistently correct when viewing an individual in a workplace environment. The addition of optimism as a basis of decision making would seem to correlate with my own observations and only enhance the data you have already observed.
So the question here is how would optimism sort of augment this?
Yeah, I think it's more of an observation. He's saying, he's saying it's very tough to generalize, but it does seem to appear in many instances CEOs tend to need to take on more risk than others, and so seeing the connection between optimism, decision making, and behavioral motivation is very, very interesting.
I mean, I think that what this comment is getting to is something really important, which is that personalities are quite complex, multifaceted things, and we've been talking very narrowly about optimism, which is one important, we think important trait. But it's by no means the only trait, and there are, as you say, the need to control, need to be liked, need for stability, need to conform. These are all components of personality that affect people's decision making, affect the way they approach new situations that they face. And kind of going back to Forrest's question from earlier about whether employees should try to screen on these.
Right.
I mean, I think it is interesting to think about developing a sort of a multifaceted personality screen and using that as part of the hiring process, and of course a lot of companies already do that.
A lot of companies do that.
I think when you sort of embed optimism in that broader, and in that broader inventory of personality traits, I think then you can kind of begin to see it in a more nuanced way.
It's interesting, right? Because I think companies have been doing this for quite some time, right? And in fact, I know my children will go online and take personality tests and say, do you know this is my personality? And I say, okay, that's great, sounds like you or doesn't sound like you. And these are like freely available online, and they put your personality into 4 buckets and stuff, right? And so companies have done this too. I remember when I was a student, I was, in high school, I was given these kind of tests, even in India, right? And so it's sort of across countries. I mean, more recently, I have been seeing in the workplace people asking questions like, would it help us in making better loans, right?
Yeah,
and so for, if I look at startups, entrepreneurs, small companies where there's very little financial information, right? And so how do I know whether this is good? How do I know if this person is trustworthy? Right.
That's right. I mean, think about Sim Khwaja's work at the Kennedy School, where he's developed this personality inventory that they use with people who are trying to administer loans to entrepreneurs who are, trying to launch businesses. That this is happening in the context of sort of a developing world, where they're trying to promote startup activity, like in South Africa, places like that. And they find success with these inventories that they use to kind of try to screen applicants.
Now, so we want a note of caution. This work is in very early stages, right?
I'm certainly not endorsing any of it.
We're not saying that's the right way. But I think it's fascinating.
It's stuff we need to learn more about.
In terms of, is there a lot, as finance professors, we tend to be all about, numbers and black and white and balance sheets and income statements and cash flows. Is there more?
About smiles or frowns.
Exactly. So is there more to it than that, right? Should we be looking at, the soft side of things, and would that actually improve our decision making? I think is a fascinating area of future research. Okay, I think we've reached the end of our questions. That was a really interesting set of questions. Right?
Yeah, we really appreciate you sending in your questions, and we've enjoyed having a chance to reach out and talk with you about this stuff.
Yeah, it helps us to think more, and I think also in terms of just future research.
Yeah,
and
exactly. No,
what
it's great to get these comments, think about new ideas. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so. So again, thanks, and let me tell you a little bit about our next faculty presenter, which will be in December, and that's going to be John Field. And he's going to be talking about the discipline of entrepreneurship.
Something, you know, connected to what we've been talking about today, given
Yeah.
given the personality traits of entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, and in fact, you know, entrepreneurship and their personality traits was something that motivated us
Actually
to do this
got us
research
started
in the first place.
Yeah.
Right, and so I think it would be very interconnected, and I'm sure it would be quite fascinating.
So be sure to tune in next month for John Field's talk, which I think will be very interesting. And thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.